Jujutsu Kaisen and Hunter x Hunter, two battle shonen known for their complex power systems and more down-to-earth style of fighting. Two series that are home to some of the coolest lightning users in the game. In this video, I'll be pairing these two electric fighters against one another. Killua Zoldyck versus Hajime Kashimo, the young prodigy of the Zoldyck assassin family versus the strongest sorcerer of the Edo period. As I always do in versus matchups like these, I'll be going over their strength, speed, durability, and hacks, all in order to determine who wins and why. Now, when it comes to Hunter x Hunter characters, Killua is not only one of the coolest, but one of the most competent when it comes to sheer talent for Nen and quality of hand-to-hand skill. A majority of Killua's best physical feats come from him enhancing his body through the use of aura, but even before learning how to use Nen, Killua is able to perform feats like casually shoving open gates that weigh 16 tons and disappearing from the sight of other potential hunters with his speed, demonstrating his superhuman levels of power and physical ability, even without factoring the power system into the equation. This fact only becomes more true after developing his control over aura and manipulating it to help him unleash more latent ability. After mastering Nen and removing the limitations put on his mind, he's casually able to blitz and behead an awakened Ramit. The blitz itself is certainly impressive, and I'll be mentioning how that scales to his speed later in the video, but even more than that, the fact that Killua was able to easily remove his head from his shoulders is a pretty good demonstration of his strength and attack potency at this point in the story. Ramit at this stage in the Chimera Ant arc should be significantly stronger and more durable than other random Chimera Ant fodder, and is even stated to be physically superior to Zazan in the Hunter x Hunter databook. Zazan was able to push Phaeton to use his Pain Packer Nen ability, a technique so strong that all of the other Phantom Troop members thought they would die if they were within its range. This is pretty important to note because Bonolenov specifically displayed a Nen ability strong enough to put him at city block level in terms of attack potency, while creating a force relative to that of 150 tons. Killua in base was able to blitz and behead a character stronger than the one that required Phaeton to pull out a trump card, so putting him on that level physically is definitely viable as a baseline. Now, unlike Gon, Killua doesn't really punch people or objects as consistently to give us a good upper limit to his attack potency, but if you use Gon during the same time frame as a measuring stick for his abilities, you could argue that he somewhat scales to Gon's ability to punch a Chimera Ant across a country, which would require about 300 kilotons of energy to do, and place them both at large town level. This is the scaling I used when going over Gon's strength in the UG versus Gon video, and while I would say it's fair to argue that these two characters are relative in stats, especially at this point in the story, with Killua potentially even being a bit stronger as an overall fighter, considering the disparity in physical stats before Nen, and the fact that their trajectory as Nen users has been pretty similar all throughout the story. The only hesitation I have with saying that Killua scales to this feat in particular is that it comes from a Jajan-Ken enhanced attack, which itself is a punch supercharged with Nen well beyond what Gon can normally do. In fact, it's been stated that Gon's rock is 10 times more powerful than all of his other Nen enhanced attacks. So if we assume that Killua scales more properly with his base punches rather than a Jajan-Ken, it'd put him closer to town level as opposed to large town level in terms of his attack potency, decreasing the relative strength of his scale by a pretty decent margin. This is only when accounting for base Killua, however, as with Godspeed in play, the increased velocity of his attacks paired with the heat and stunning ability of his lightning should push his attack potency even further, although pinpointing exactly how much it does is a bit tricky. You could attempt to scale him to UP based on his ability to very marginally damage him by burning his cheeks and repeatedly stunning him with his aura, but UP comes out and just says that everyone confronting him is 10% of his physical power or less, meaning that Killua is in no way truly relative to the Royal Guard strength-wise. Poof implies that even at full power, Killua would give him trouble, but not only is Poof the physically weakest Chimera Ant, at least among the Royal Guard, but he also specifies that within the context of speed, Killua would be tricky rather than an actual extended battle to the death. This means it's probably more productive to go back to Yuppie and consider how he does against him. So if we take Yuppie's statement and highball Killua to say that he's exactly a 10th of his max strength, using the prior Rage Blast as an example of what that should look like, while using Godspeed, Killua would see a sizable increase in ability from town level back up to large town level, almost giving him an exact 10 times increase from what he's able to do in his base form. I come to this conclusion because Yuppie's Rage Blast was calculated to be on the low end of city level, and when taking the amount of force produced in that instance and dividing it by 10, we get a value placing Killua in a slightly higher tier of strength. For the most part though, Killua doesn't really seem to be a character that relies on overwhelming force to take down his opponents. While his durability should scale relative to his attack potency, neither his resilience nor striking strength are his greatest attributes. That honor goes to his speed. In the midst of the Chimera Ant arc, Killua seems pretty confident that he could take on an entire army, even going out of his way to explicitly mention fighter jets, which can reach speeds of up to 2,000 miles per hour, or close to 3 times the speed of sound. Being decently faster than sound is pretty consistent for even mid-tier physical fighters in Hunter x Hunter, as the entire Phantom Troop was capable of reacting to Uvagin's deafening scream before it reached their ears. This is particularly notable because even characters like Shalnark are capable of reacting to something traveling at the speed of sound, and he's not even physically strong enough to go up against a Chimera Ant grunt that Killua would be able to blitz and one-shot many times over. This isn't even accounting for the difference between a Chimera Ant grunt and Ramit, who's leagues above all of the characters that the Phantom Troop fought within the Chimera Ant arc. You could stay within this tier of speed for base Killua by arguing that he should be just a few times faster than sound, but based on his performance against Yuppie and capability of dodging him even in base, you might be able to argue that he scales much higher, even without looking at his Godspeed abilities. During the initial stages of the invasion, God and Killua are shown and stated to be capable of avoiding Yuppie's attacks, and this is important to note for 2 separate reasons. The first comes from the fact that Yuppie is a Royal Guard member, meaning that by nature of his existence, he scales vastly over characters like Cheetu, who are able to easily dodge bullets mere inches from his face and move so quickly relative to them that he could be considered 20 times faster than sound itself. Gon and Killua being capable of avoiding attacks from a character on this level is already impressive and pretty considerably upscales him from the 2 to 3 times the speed of sound that I had him placed at earlier. The second piece of important information stems from Yuppie's own mind, as when struck by Killua's lightning later in the arc, he thinks that it's inconceivable that he didn't react or even perceive the attack before it hit him, implying that his reaction and perception speeds are relative to or even greater than that of a stroke of lightning. We know the reason that Yuppie didn't notice in actuality wasn't because the lightning was too fast for him to notice, but because it was invisible until it actually hit him. However, directly following this, Killua was able to perception blitz Yuppie and entirely disappear from his vision and surpass him in speed so blatantly that you could put Yuppie and Killua in the hyperbolic time chamber, give him 1,000,000 years within there, and he would have no hope of ever tagging Killua in this state. What this all means is that Killua, while using Godspeed particularly, is capable of perception blitzing a character who in his own words should be capable of reacting or at least visually registering literal bolts of lightning. This level of combat speed is actually pretty consistent when you take into account what Godspeed actually is and how it enhances his speed so much. Rather than having Killua actually react to attacks visually or based off of his own natural senses, he uses aura to predict and respond to his opponents at speed impossible for just about anyone to comprehend, intentionally utilizing the phenomenon he used when becoming a living dartboard earlier in this same arc. During the tail end of this dartboard battle, it's said by the Chimera Ant attacking him that pulling off the feat that he did would require light speed reaction time. And while it's made clear that Killua used prior information to make reacting and actually grabbing the dart easier for him, applying this precognition by cloaking himself in a lightning aura makes it seem as if you're fighting someone that fast. If I had to put it in terms that are more simple, I'd simply say he's cheating his way to this level of speed. Well, not actually capable of reacting light speed attacks in the conventional sense. By using a mix of precognition and a bypassing of his central nervous system, Killua is able to combat you at a speed quite close to that impossible velocity. For Jujutsu Kaisen fans, use this as an analogy. Godspeed Killua would be capable of reacting to sure hit attacks as they touch his skin. Crazy, I know, but what he did versus those dartboard chimera ants is exactly that. It's because of this subconscious reactions in Whirlwind that when he uses Godspeed for travel, it's not as impressive, because rather than subconsciously react using purely aura, he actually consciously navigates his body again, and as a result, slows everything down. There's also just a disparity in most Battle Shonen between a character's travel speed and combat speed, but I thought it would be important to note the difference. Now, aside from physical scaling, Killua has a pretty decent pool of moves in his arsenal as a result of his assassin training and Nen mastery. Due to the Zoldyck family training, Killua was able to manipulate his body at will, with the most lethal form of this body modification, allowing him to sharpen and harden his hands to make piercing his opponents very simple, as well as whipping his arms around in a snake-like fashion to alter the trajectory of his attacks and amplify his attacking speed and power that much more. On top of all of this, he's extremely resistant to poison and electricity, as the amount of voltage that he's capable of running through his body would instantly kill him if he were a normal person. If that wasn't enough, he's also able to create after images by moving in a certain rhythmic fashion, as well as fighting for dozens of hours without any sign of fatigue. On the Nen side of things, he's capable of suppressing his aura completely to disappear, coat his body in electric Nen to stun his enemies, and even launch massive bolts of lightning from his finger pretty casually. I already went in depth on Godspeed when discussing and explaining just how fast he truly is, meaning that with this, I've covered the broad strokes of Killua's abilities. Before we can get into exactly how he would perform though, we have to go over Jujutsu Kaisen's very own God of Lightning, Hajime Kashimo. When it comes to Jujutsu Kaisen and the overall power hierarchy, Kashimo finds himself closer to the top of it than the bottom. While he isn't necessarily at the uppermost echelon where characters like Gojo and Sukuna reside, to be fair, anyone that isn't those two doesn't exist there either yet. I would argue though that he's simply one, maybe two spots below that, especially when taking his curse technique into account. Without Mythic Beast Amber, Kashimo's bag is relatively small compared to Killua's, as he mainly focuses on close quarters combat with some lightning curse energy and a bolt that he can send at his opponent after building up a charge. As we'll discuss later though, with Mythic Beast Amber activated, he does have a little bit of a bigger bag, but first, let's go over how he performs without his curse technique. In base form, Kashimo's speed could be anywhere from a couple times the speed of sound, all the way to being a low-end lightning timer, as Jujutsu Kaisen speed scaling can get particularly hairy, especially for a character with a small sample size of opponents like Kashimo. On the low end, you can say pretty definitively that he'd be above the likes of Shibuya Yuji, who is capable of reacting to piercing blood and just generally having some pretty good reaction feats. What's troublesome for Kashimo is that he doesn't necessarily have a direct line to the Naoya Mach 3 scaling in a way that many other high tiers in the story do. Maki before her awakening was completed was overwhelmed by this level of speed, and since Kashimo has no real objective interaction with her in this department, it's hard to say definitively that he'd be beyond that level of speed. You could definitely argue that his relativity to Jackpot Akari places him in the same top tier echelon as an awakened Maki, but it certainly isn't as sound of an argument as I'd like. Beyond that speed-wise though, if you think Akari was actually capable of avoiding his lightning bolt in these two instances, which is, I'll say, vague to say the least, Kashimo's ability to fight on equal footing up close would imply some vague similarity to lightning in movement. Now, I disagree that Kashimo's physical speed should compare to his lightning-based attacks, and that's simply because everything in the narrative implies that his bolts of lightning act as a trump card for his base form. Not only are these attacks simply more lethal than his regular punches, but Akari and Panda seem to have much more trouble even perceiving the attack coming their way when compared to how they actually deal with him getting up close and personal. You can use this sort of scaling as a solid highball, but not only is Akari dodging the lightning very, very debatable, but Kashimo in base also scaling to that is iffy, to say the least. With this technique activated though, he's stated to surpass the limitations of humanity, which certainly gives the impression that he's gone well beyond what he physically was capable of before. The problem with scaling Mythic Beast Amber, at least in physical capacity, is twofold however. The first problem arises when taking a look at who he fights in this form. while fighting Sukuna in nearly every other scenario would be unambiguously impressive and get us a pretty good gauge on where he scales. The fact of the matter is that he's the only person in the series who has had a fight with this version of Sukuna. The problem with that is that this version of Sukuna is vastly nerfed due to his fight with Gojo mere moments before, to a degree that is just unquantifiable. The second problem actually comes from the vagueness of this narrator statement. He stated to surpass the limitations of humanity, sure, but that doesn't really hold much weight without feats to back it up, especially since a large majority of high tiers also have limit-breaking techniques that would generally surpass the previously established limitations. This means that we'll just have to rely on the few feats shown and try to use Kashimo's performance against Sukuna side by side in order to glean some semblance of a physical difference in speed via contrast. Before the technique is activated, we see that Sukuna is capable of blocking and avoiding Kashimo's attacks, with him struggling to do so and sustaining much more damage when Mythic Beast Amber is on the table. It's definitely not beyond Sukuna's perception, as we actually get panels of him reacting before taking these hits, but it's a sizable enough increase to make a difference in a close encounter. Highballing, you could say that his physical speed is vaguely beyond that of lightning itself, with him possessing both sound and light-based attacks that stem from his manipulation of all lightning-based phenomena. Once again, it's difficult to even argue that Kashimo scales to these specific attacks, especially when it's ambiguous if Sukuna himself is capable of doing so. Well, the King of Curses is able to avoid the EM blast. Whether he was aim dodging or not is difficult to decipher, and in situations like these, it's better to err on the side of caution. Regardless, he does have techniques within his bag that work off of electromagnetic waves, which means that with Mythic Beast Amber activated, he can certainly pack a punch. Just as it is with speed, however, Kashimo's strength in particular is very, very difficult to gauge, especially in his base form. And I say that mainly because he relies on his fists quite a bit and uses most of his attacks on characters that don't have an established durability relative to the rest of the cast. Take Akari for example. While he demonstrates some really impressive feats in the Kashimo fight, this version of him honestly has no durability feats outside of surviving Kashimo's blows, which makes it particularly hard to see how he compares to his peers, and as a result, how he performs in a cross-verse setting. This circular nature to Hikari's durability really makes it tough to assess Kashimo. And because of this, it's actually Panda who gives us a pretty good gauge as to how strong Kashimo's basic attacks and bolts of lightnings should be. We see that with one punch, Kashimo is able to tear through Panda's body and destroy one of his cores, and follow this up with an extremely aggressive combination of attacks that puts Gorilla Mode Panda on his ass. With his lightning bolt, he's even able to rip through Panda's sister, who is supposed to be the strongest of all of Panda's modes. Now, why is this relevant? Well, this is actually a similar feat to Mechamaru's ultimate cannon, which was able to destroy one of Panda's cores and force him to swap into his gorilla mode form. This attack was calced to be city block level, meaning that Kashimo at the bare minimum was throwing out blows that pretty closely scale or maybe even surpass what Mechamaru's ultimate cannon can do. Based on his dominance as a sorcerer in the Edo period, you can also argue that he's above or at least relative to Ishigori in ability, with Ishigori's Granite Blast performing a feat that would require small towns level of force. And while he isn't capable of outputting as much cursed energy as Ryu, it's very possible that it's the lightning nature of his attacks that allows him to be on a similar playing field. With this technique activated, the level of power that Kashimo has would fly through the roof, albeit in a way that's pretty hard to compare. Due to him only beating up on a heavily injured Sukuna and then getting dealt with, it's kinda tough to say what the potency of his abilities look like. If you just take a stab in the dark and say that Mythic Beast Amber Kashimo is so strong that he should just be at least on the Arame tier of sorcerer, you could attempt to argue that his EM and sound blasts are similarly potent to the ice structure that Arame made, which was calced to require town levels of cursed energy output or around 42 kilotons of TNT. This relies pretty heavily on speculation and guesswork because Kashimo and Arame fight entirely differently and use entirely different types of ranged attacks, but it does get Kashimo to a place much higher than he would be otherwise. If you really wanted to be generous, you could also use domain scaling to highball Kashimo's use of Jujutsu to mountain level, based on characters like Jogo having enough cursed energy and outputting ability to create a mountain-sized structure within the barrier. Now this wouldn't correlate to his durability or punching power at all, but potentially he'd reach this level of potency with his attacks through sheer hacks. Once again, this is not a very concrete way of scaling Kashimo in particular, but as always, I'll consider the range of options for the characters when I finally pit them against one another. If you want to know my opinion, Kashimo probably more closely scales to that city block level all the way to maybe small to large town level if you really want to highball battle him. Now, aside from his physical stats, Kashimo, I guess, has a few offshoot abilities from either Mythic Beast Amber or his Lightning Light Cursed Energy in general, but his hacks have mostly been discussed as a result of them pertaining to his physical abilities. That being said, I haven't mentioned his resistance to lightning-based attacks, as well as his X-ray vision when using Mythic Beast Amber, but honestly, only one of those abilities will be super relevant in this fight. With all that out of the way though, it's finally time to decide. Between Killua Zoldyck and Hajime Kashimo, who wins? And how does their fight play out? The outcome of this fight is rather simple, yet remains intriguing specifically because of the kinds of fighters that both of these characters are. And if you haven't caught on already, the winner might shock you. All right, I'll let myself out. Well, I'd bet money on Killua being more proficient up close due to his assassin upbringing. It isn't crazy to say that they should be on similar footing skill-wise. Much like the young prodigy, Kashimo has shown that he knows how to scrap pretty well and skillfully when the need arises. And hand-to-hand combat at a high level is what this fight will come down to more often than not, because neither character's ranged lightning abilities would work on the other. While neither character is completely immune to lightning, or at least not stated to be so outright, both have been said to be resistant to ungodly amounts of electricity without impeding their ability to fight. This means that Kashimo's Lightning Light Cursed Energy and Charge Up Bolt wouldn't be effective against Killua, and Killua's Thunderbolt and Lightning Palm would have no effect on Kashimo. In terms of their general strength and durability, I'd also say that they'd be within a similar range, both being characters that can punch and take punches that range from small town to town level full stop. At the higher ends, Kashimo's attacks may hit a bit harder, but that only really has to do with his lightning discharge, and as I already mentioned, that doesn't really have a place in this fight. At range, Kashimo may have a slight advantage with his staff, but Killua's lethality in base isn't anything to take lightly, as his knife-like hands paired with his snake-like limbs will chip away at Kashimo's health if those attacks land. We could give Killua his yo-yos here, but considering that he doesn't really use them after Greed Island, and once he develops Godspeed, they don't seem to be a large part of his arsenal, I decided that it's not really all that necessary. This means that by and large, the outcome of this fight will be determined by who is faster and who can avoid the most damage while getting in their own attacks. On the low end, Kashimo and Killua base to base would actually be within range of each other, with Killua's fighter jet statement placing him around Mach 3, and comparatively, Kashimo's place in Jujutsu hierarchy, putting him within that similar tier as well. It's when highballing Kashimo's speed, though, that things tip heavily in its favor. Now, I want to make clear, this highball is something that I'm not necessarily entirely in favor of, but it is possible. So, in the event that Kashimo is actually capable of fighting relative to a Hikari who can avoid lightning outright, this would place him somewhere in that ballpark of speed, whereas Killua more reasonably would only be a few dozen times faster than sound, specifically in his base form. Technically, you could highball Killua to that level of speed as well, but it's extremely inconsistent to do so and is contradicted by surrounding context as far as I'm concerned. So in the best case scenario for Kashimo, he'd be able to outspeed Killua quite confidently and just pepper him with attacks until he's down for the count. However, with Godspeed being on the table and a constant source of electricity from Kashimo being available, the tables turn once more. Lowballing Godspeed Killua as much as possible would lead to him being a lightning timer in combat, already being faster than Kashimo. But if you more appropriately assess his speed in this mode, him and Kashimo wouldn't even be moving in the same dimension. With Killua's responses being automated, he would be moving at a pace that Kashimo can never dream of, and considering the fact that in character, Kashimo would never use his technique on anyone not named Sukuna, Killua would claim his life right then and there. But in the spirit of a versus battle, in the spirit of a nice, good match, let's assume that Kashimo acknowledges Killua as an opponent worth dying for and unleashes his curse technique. How does the fight play out then? Well, at that point, the gap between Kashimo and Killua, at least when lowballed, shrinks to nearly zero, with both being lightning timers in physical speed and neither being able to harm the other too much with their hacks, meaning that it comes down to a straight punching match. Killua versus Kashimo. Kashimo's Sound Blast wouldn't really have a place in this fight because, I mean, they're sound-based, and they're going to be much slower than either of these characters at this point. And while Hajime does have the EM waves, which, once again, speaking for a lowballed Killua, would vastly outspeed him, the fact that Sukuna was able to avoid his aim despite getting clocked by his punches a second earlier implies that the charge time for that attack leaves an opening to counter or avoid it. In this scenario, it would come down to a test of endurance and stamina. Would Killua's Godspeed run out and lose in the fight, or would Mythic Beast Amber deactivate before that and end Kashimo's life in that way? Under normal circumstances, I'd kind of just shrug because I have no idea. Kashimo gets cooked too quickly for us to determine how long he can keep up his technique, and Killua's length of Godspeed time just varies wildly. In some instances, he seems to run out after a few attacks, but in others, he's confident that he can clash with a Royal Guard all night. In the event that Killua didn't properly charge, Kashimo would probably just kick his ass as soon as Godspeed runs out, but the problem that arises for Kashimo is that a majority of his attacks would be contributing to Killua's charge, as we see that it's literally just regular lightning that allows him to keep up Godspeed. Even if Killua would naturally run out of that aura before Kashimo runs out of his technique usage, him even being touched by Kashimo's cursed energy would be enough to keep him going. And when it comes to the physical stamina aspect, well, one of them has feats of fighting and waging a mini war for over a day, and the other doesn't. So if it comes down to a contest of stamina, I still have to say that Killua takes the cake, with the gap in outcome and strength only growing more and more as you become more generous with Godspeed Killua scaling. If you believe that his automated attacks allow him to essentially cheat his way to lightspeed feats, then Kashimo is cooked. No other way around it. This fight is quite interesting, and I would pay a lot to see it play out. But in just about every viable scenario, Killua secures a victory for himself and sends Kashimo off to the next world. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like this, you can check out these two Hunter x Hunter versus Jujutsu Kaisen videos. And if you have some matchups you'd like to see from me, comment them down below so I can get started on some new great videos for you guys. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.